Was there an initial spark of inspiration for the Southern Reach?
Yes, there was.
Okay.
It was dental surgery, actually. I had
Dental
intense
surgery.
dental surgery, 3 teeth removed, and a root canal.
Okay.
And then I had while I was on the painkillers, I had this intense dream of a tower tunnel, as I saw in the dream, and saw these words on a wall. And I actually wrote them down in the middle of the night, and then fell asleep. Yeah, exactly. And then in the morning, I woke up and I had the first 10 pages of the novel in my head as well.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was very spontaneous. And those 10 pages didn't really change. They were the beginning of Annihilation. And then I just wrote the rest in kind of like a semi-asleep state over a month. And I had a novel.
Oh my God,
it was
that's
ridiculous.
crazy.
Yes, I know, exactly. Now I had kind of primed my imagination by thinking consciously I want to write something about Florida, but obviously it came out very differently than I imagined.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah.
If that's the case, and you had sort of almost like a fever dream that led to one novel, how do the others progress from there? Because when you read the trilogy, or well, no longer a trilogy,
right.
At first,
a trilogy with a doppelganger.
Yeah,
attached,
exactly.
Yes.
That's a gorgeous way to put it.
Yes,
So how did if it wasn't, and initially it was just the one fever dream
Yeah.
novel, how did that happen?
Well, there's two things that come to mind. One is that halfway through writing any novel, I begin to sense that there's more story and that there's more novels. And so halfway through Annihilation, I was like, aha, there's a second book that's an exploration or an expedition into the Southern Reach, not Area X. And then I knew, about at the very beginning of Authority that I had a third book. And so that's the way it happens, and that's because authority and acceptance are kind of intertwined in terms of what they talk about. But then the second thing is that my process is different in every book. So the dream thing happens a fair amount to me, believe it or not. It seems very easy. But I also love revision. So when I get into revision on a novel that doesn't come to me that way, it's kind of the same thing because I'm so immersed in the scenes, and I'm so in the moment of it. It's like I'm back in the fictive dream. So I've learned to love revision so much that it doesn't really matter whether there's this initial spark or whether it's a hard slog to begin with. At some point, I get into that zone. So that's what happened with Authority and Acceptance.
And you say that the dream influence happens quite a lot because
it does actually, and it happens when I'm sick. And I think that's because it kind of reduces some barrier in my mind, like the editor in my mind goes away, or some part of the subconscious kind of comes to the surface, and the creativity with that. So my first series, Ambergris, I came up with after I had a bout of mono. And so sometimes it's that, sometimes it could be a traumatic event that kind of puts me in an altered state, but it seems to be conducive for writing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask about the titles.
Yes.
So obviously you've got 4 titles that all begin with the letter A, and they're all one-word titles.
Yes.
What was the stylistic and thematic choice behind that?
Yes, well, I mean, I always think, what kind of title, what kind of book is this? Does it need a thematic title? Does it need a very concrete image? Does it need the name of the character like Bourne does? And in this case, I realized it was thematic, and I was really influenced by the South African writer named Coetzee, who had a book called Disgrace. And it was pretty amazing because it allowed all these kind of seeming digressions that were actually thematically relevant. So I liked that. I liked the fact that the novel could contain more because it was a thematic title. So with Annihilation, also there was the multiplicity of the title. The fact that having been raised somewhat Buddhist, annihilation means something else. It means something beneficial, like the annihilation of self, but in service of getting to some place better. So I like the idea of the titles being sometimes ironic, sometimes a little sneaky, and then with Absolution, there's the obvious things about what that word means, but who are they applied to? So I thought a lot about people who don't realize they need, who go through life never realizing that they need forgiveness, and people who are seeking forgiveness for things that they shouldn't, that they should absolve themselves of. So I was thinking of things like that, and that kind of tied into some of the themes of abandonment in part 2, which, without going into too much detail, I like to do this thing where I take something topical like ghosting, and I think, what is the universal theme of this? Well, it's abandonment, right? And so those are the kinds of things that went into thinking about Absolution.
After 10 years, you've had the trilogy out, and why now? What was it that inspired you to make a 4th book now?
Right. Well, I mean, I had had the beginning of the first section, Dead Town, written down, this expedition of biologists into the Forgotten Coast, 20 years before Area X's border comes down. And I was thinking, this really is amazing, because I think what it is that the beginning of the Area X story is much earlier, and this expedition actually influenced how Area X manifested for a variety of reasons. I wrote like 5 pages. I liked the style, but something was missing. And then a few years later, I realized, an operative at Central, the secret agency in the Southern Reach books, is piecing this story together from files. And then I realized, it's old Jim, who we know from a very, very kind of fraught piano scene in the Village Bar in Acceptance. He was actually an operative for Central all along. And so then the story kind of like expanded to the point where it does, to some extent, the first piece is self-contained, but it then all clicks together like a puzzle that becomes a novel.
Absolutely.
And that was really intriguing to me too, to have these 3 very stylistically different pieces. But old Jim is the glue that holds them together, or the chemical compound that holds them together. Even in the third part, where he's not as prevalent, but he's still there.
Yeah,
kind of haunting it.
The way that I read these books is that they feel like they have a reverence for connection. They play on bonds that people have between each other, and also the bond between us and the natural world around us. Is that something that you feel as the writer? Was that a core tenet of your writing process, or is that something that came along?
I think that feeling of connection, or the lack of it, or the loss of it, is really prevalent in the work. It sometimes has to do with the fact that trauma is very prevalent in the work, which I think is something that's common to a lot of people. A lot of people experience some kind of trauma, even if they don't name it that.
Oh, for sure.
And then also at the core of my books is love of some kind. Whether in the Southern Reach, I think it's more kind of a platonic, like, bond of friendship almost, or connection on working on a team, whatever you want to call it, as opposed to a romantic love that you find in some of the other books. But it's very much something that I thought about. I thought about how tragic it was that these people that I'm chronicling in the Southern Reach kind of sacrificed their lives and sometimes their connections to other human beings in service of trying to, figure out what Area X is. And, the tragedy is that they can't.
Absolution opens with Dead Town, which, as we said before, almost exists as a kind of prequel novella. That's how it feels at first. Is that where the book began in your mind as you started to construct it? Was Dead Town the initial thing that you came up with, or did you start somewhere else?
It definitely was. I had another fragment that became part of part 2, but that's kind of a funny story in that I was leading a writing workshop, and I always leave something out for the students to mark up and encourage them to, so they see it's not personal, we're just doing analysis. And so maybe it's less frightening for them if they mark up my work in progress. And so only one student did. And it turned out to be, of all people, Kristen Rupenian, who went on to write Cat Person, which became a movie. It's fairly big in the States, probably not very well known here, but it just strikes me as very funny, given the kind of fearlessness of her fiction, that she turned out to be as fearless. And because she sat me down, at this point she was a writing student, she wasn't a published writer. She sat me down and she had red penned the entire thing. And she said, look, you got 3 good sentences here. And I'm sure the other students all thought this was a trap, if they were to do this, that I would somehow, be mad. But I was just so happy that someone had the gumption to do that. And she was right. Like, those 3 sentences are all there left. So that was a moment where it's like, I did this the wrong way. I need to rethink this. So I had some of part 2 in my head, but not the right way. And then on July 31st of last year, I woke up, not from a dream, but just with the entire structure in my head.
Oh my God.
And I did not stop writing until December 31st. On December 31st, I had 150,000 word final draft.
Wow.
Which means that I had written about 400,000 words of draft in 6 months. But I've been thinking about it for a while.
Yeah, but that's still an incredible
But it was
amount.
it was exhausting.
Yeah.
But I was kind of driven. I don't know how to describe it. There was this music in my head, and I knew the notes, and I knew if I stopped writing, I'd lose it.
Yeah, I can imagine some people who are more cynically driven say things like, well, isn't that convenient timing? 10 years. Did you need
exactly.
something?
Yeah. I certainly wouldn't have written a book with so much cannibalism in it if I was trying to reach an audience. So.
For sure, absolutely. You would have played it a lot safer. I need this
Part
thing.
3 probably wouldn't even be in there, right?
Right, exactly. One of my favorite things about the entire series is your willingness to experiment with tone and style.
Yes.
As well as with naming conventions.
Yes.
Something that I've talked about on my channel and with my audience is the fact that, to put it bluntly, your characters have some fun and silly names.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy that.
Yeah.
But you also play around with writing conventions, and there are things that only, or at least mostly, exist in one novel that don't feature in the others.
Yes.
Like, for example, in Annihilation, the characters don't have any proper nouns, any names. And how I think in Acceptance there is a second person narrative style that doesn't exist in the others.
That's right.
I believe.
Yes.
What was the thinking behind doing that, making those almost unique to each book?
First of all, when it comes to like a single novel, I have a huge problem just like following if there are like 3 or 4 different characters in first person, for example.
Yeah.
And so I'm always looking for ways to differentiate by using different things. But I think with the biologist it just came that way, and then with Authority I felt like I think I tried writing it in first person and I realized I needed the distance of third, or somehow third person kind of gave me less distance. Like you can make third person almost seem like first. And then second person, I really wanted to involve the reader with the psychologist character. I wanted them to be kind of not complicit, but to be alongside her in a way that was meant to be very intimate, very immersive. And so, yes, it may be jarring at first to encounter it, but my hope is then you're literally kind of performing the same actions.
Oh, yeah.
And that's also kind of, I think, a little poignant, because they're actions that we kind of guess may not lead to where she wants to be led. So you're kind of like enacting them in a sense as you go through it in a way that's kind of a memorial to it. And I think it really helps in the very end of Acceptance.
I haven't read that many second person narratives, but I have to say the word complicit is so apt. I did feel like I was almost uncomfortably intimate with the character in that moment. Why are you, the writer, making me feel this connection?
And it's a bit of a requiem in terms of how things work out. I've been more worried about giving readers what they need and less about what they want. The trade-off there is simply that if you give them what you think they need as opposed to what they want, and we're talking also about what they expect from like tropes in certain genres, then what you give them has to be commensurate, or they'll be disappointed. They have to get something from it unexpected that they truly did need.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that was my thought. And with the Southern Reach, particularly, readers have been so generous that they made even Absolution like very easy to write. I had no jitters about writing. I just like, they've taught me that I can go for it, right? That's a lovely gift, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's a really nice thing to know. I have to ask about Area X, even though I really love what we said earlier about the characters. But fans have been theorizing and speculating about what Area X is. I don't want to ask you what Area X is. I want to ask, what does it mean to you? And I feel like that's a slightly different question.
I think it means to me something to do with how I see a novel in general, and a novelist as providing not necessarily something predictive, and not necessarily answers all the time, but an immersive experience where you live in the same kind of fictive dream that the writer did, and you also kind of contribute to it, right? Like you leave a space for the reader to kind of build the story with you. And then also the idea that a novel should pose important questions. It may not always give answers, or it may give a variety of possible answers.
Right.
But I think these novels, and you pointed to the thematic nature of the titles, have allowed me to explore a lot. And so Area X is not like one thing, like the fact that some people have said that, you know, it's a comment that the world would be better off with human beings. It's not that at all. It's just simply posing a question of like, what is our impact on the world? Maybe how can that be less? You know, the tragedy of some of the things that we do and the ways that we behave and the institutions. Because really these are also systems novels. They're exploring systems of power and the way in which we all kind of live in kind of semi-deranged, semi-functional systems, and we have to deal with that. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, the people in Southern Reach are compromised by the people that they are supposed to be able to trust higher up, and that they still have to basically go to a 9-to-5 job. It may be a very peculiar one in some ways, but it's still recognizable.
Absolutely.
And they still have almost as little agency as we do in some circumstances. You know?
What is your favorite book of the whole 4-book series, and why?
Oof, that's really tough because I like different ones for different reasons. I would say that most recently, it's hard to go back and reread your older work sometimes.
Sure.
And sometimes they seem fresh. And right now, I'm still understanding Absolution because, it's such a recent revelation that I'm still kind of with that book. And it is basically like 3 novellas that interlock. You could say that it is a novel, but they're so different. And it's hard to say Lowry is the section I love the most because it's the most out there. It was the most fun to write. But there's the ending of Dead Town and this idea that these biologists encounter something in the same way that medieval people encountered, like, say, comets and didn't understand.
Yeah.
I find extremely thought-provoking, and yet it's so visceral in the moment. So I think writing that scene at least was one of my favorite things because it kind of shook me to my core while I was writing it. And that's why the writing kind of breaks down in a lovely way, and I left it that way.
Right.
Because I think it reflects the moment.
The Southern Reach has a unique way, in my opinion, as a reader, of being read as something that is kind of pulpy sci-fi horror, and also something that is incredibly thought-provoking, thematically deep, eco-fiction, as some people have called it. Was that your intention as you wrote it, that you wanted to bridge a gap between those two things, or is it just something that happened?
I think I always think, am I writing a renovation or an innovation? What does that mean? And like Dead Astronauts is kind of an innovation. I don't think there's another novel that exists that's like it. These books were more renovations. We're playing off of established tropes, any even supernatural expedition into the unknown, haunted houses even, if you think about the Southern Reach organization.
Absolutely.
So, I do think of them as a recombination and a renovation, and also playing off of movies. Like, I think the lead character in Alien has a lot of influence on Annihilation to some degree.
Sure, I can see that.
Yeah, so it's definitely a lot of things, including also Kafka and that strain of the weird. So and I think you can get to a really interesting place if you if you assimilate those influences and those ideas such that what comes out is on some level familiar, but also has a deep, rich strain of strangeness that's really satisfying. Hopefully that's what it does for a number of readers at least.
I can feel everything you just said. Yeah, thinking back to my experience reading them, absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting how there can be an incredible separation between reader and writer. But as you're speaking about these books, the feeling that I had resonates so much. So there's a truth there, which I think is lovely. Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
I really appreciate it.
This has been a lovely chat. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.